Hey, you are listening to The Growth Signal. My name is Alyssa Nolte,
And I'm Daniel Horowitz.
and we're going to get right into it. Daniel, what is your hot take?
So I would say working in, kind of like the intersection of SEO and AI search right now, I would say AI search is both super revolutionary and super overrated at the same time.
Okay, I love this topic, and I think you may be one of the first people to come on this show and have this conversation, which is actually quite impressive because I've done over like 150 episodes in the last calendar year. So the fact that you're the first one to bring this to bear, I'm really excited to have this conversation. One, I agree with you because I'm still waiting for Gemini to be my magic little search bot. And two, tell me more about your perspective. What are you seeing in the market?
Yeah, so I would say definitely at bigger companies, especially, but even some smaller companies, there's this idea that like, oh, we have to kind of like jettison everything we had done with SEO. We need to go all into AI search. People are not using Google anymore. People are using ChatGPT. I mean, now recently Gemini has become a big player, but a few months ago it was not. But it's like 80% of search traffic is still Google. Sure, it's not the high of 90% of what it used to be, but like, that is still where the vast majority of web traffic is coming from. That's not to say that AI search is a great brand discovery layer, right? It's a great way to show up, but people don't click through to those results, especially the more that these companies have iterated this, the less that they're sending traffic to the open web. So it's very important to be on these platforms to be discovered, especially when people are doing comparison content. I mean, I work for a company called Informatica. We're an AI data management company. We were actually recently acquired by Salesforce, and now we're a Salesforce company. But we're all about showing up for different layers of like data management. So let's say master data management, data catalog, data quality, etc. But we kind of help companies work with their data and make sure that it's cleaned and trusted for especially for AI use cases. So it's really important that we come up when people are searching topics around these. That's not to say that deals don't close based on a brand mention, right? Like this is a long enterprise cycle. People have to get into kind of like a lead flow. Talk to sales, sign up for a demo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, if people had maybe considered us like a bit of an outdated company, I mean, that's a big perception we're fighting against. So we historically have been an on-premises solution. So Informatica is like a 30-year-old company. So, kind of like a dinosaur in internet terms, right? But we want to be known as a cloud data management company, and that's kind of been the journey for the last 5 years. So, from an AI search perspective, we did a sort of like a deep dive analysis into a ton of prompts, and we found that we were showing up for on-premises solution Power Center at a 4-to-1 ratio of IDMC. So, like, that's a big problem, right? If we're already kind of fighting this market perception, and then that market perception is showing up in AI search, this is different than SEO, though, right? Like, for SEO, like, we're of course most traffic for enterprise companies is, I would say, the majority brand, but we certainly show up for a lot of unbranded terms, but like we're not fighting that perception on our website. Maybe you could create content about cloud data management, which we do, and things like that. But for AI search, it's like, well, it's just taking sentiment that already exists on the internet, and then it's training off that. So if somebody in a Reddit post 5 years ago was talking about how like, oh, this on-premises solution, blah blah blah, like it doesn't really know. So from an AI search perspective, we have to combat this perception. So we did things like updated a lot of modernization pages and things like that. Like there's a lot you can do on your own website, but there's also this offsite component too of like I don't think anyone's cracked the code, right? Of like how do you slide into Reddit and like add value without being self promotional and things like that. So in that sense, it's a really like almost like underutilized, and like there's a lot of opportunity, but also like don't over index on it is my point. Because like if we did everything just to fight that perception, well then we're not really growing our overall search presence, right?
I want to touch on a comment that you made about how people are using AI, but they're not clicking through. So, one of the things that we did was a research study. Oh, God, it would have been like 2017 now. So, like a lifetime in the age of the internet. And we did this information study that had to do with website experiences and the fact that people were designing, especially on the enterprise B2B world, were designing their websites for decision makers, right? People who were going to ultimately sign the check, sign the contract.
Sure.
And what we discovered in that research process is that a majority of the people who were visiting these websites were not decision makers. They were what we called shortlist makers. They were the people who were determining which three were going to be presented
Mhm.
to their boss. And it occurs to me that as you were saying that, you were talking about there's no click through. Well, when I think about when I search into my Google Gemini and I say, "Okay, I'm looking for a solution to solve my problem," it will give me 3 options, essentially a short list as the decision maker. And so I wonder how much of that behavior has changed of our shortlist makers. How much are they just using AI to make their shortlist on their behalf and doing very little research, where it used to be they'd evaluate 15 different opportunities or solutions, narrow it down to 3 to 5 to present to their boss. How much more of that discoverability is happening inside of AI? And if you don't have a way for AI to recognize you or discover you or recommend you, are you missing out on the opportunity to even make the shortlist?
Absolutely. Yeah, you definitely are. And I think the big thing too is that there's been a lot of tactics that have specifically been, promoted in kind of like the AI search, whatever, people are calling it AEO, GEO space. And now they're being penalized heavily, but they were working for a long
Yeah.
time. So a big one is doing these kind of like self-serving listicles. So let's say you were, like a B2B SaaS SEO agency, and you wrote an article about like best B2B SaaS SEO agencies. And then, of course, you put yourself at the top, right?
Right,
And you
you're
have,
number 1.
right,
There's
of
9
course,
others, but I'm
that's
number 1.
it's not
Yeah.
biased at all. That's not biased at all. And that was actually working for
Mhm.
AI search for a long time. But now Google is themselves are penalizing it. And now that Google is becoming, a major player in AI search as well, not just traditional search, that's going to be a problem because that's going to influence Gemini as well if they're penalizing it on, the traditional Google algorithm. So, it's like everything works until it doesn't, right? So instead of doing those like, best of lists, you could do comparison content. You could take yourself and, let's say 4 or 5 other competitors, and or even and build a little topical authority map. Do one against one, one against one, one against one, and then build a broader article and then link it all together. That could work, and you could compare yourself on features. Especially for software, something like that. That could be really important because I mean, at least for Informatica, we kind of compete on like 8 different fronts of the data management layer. So, like I was saying, master data management, data quality, and like there's different companies that specialize in a lot of these, but we're the only all-in-one solution on the market, right? So you could do content that says, master Informatica, master data management versus, another company, MDM, and then you can kind of dive deep into that. And I think the problem with that though is there's obviously like that legal comparison, that legal compliance element, but then also like, do companies necessarily want to be honest about their shortcomings on their own website?
Yeah.
So there's that too. And then if you're putting out information of like, oh well, we're perfect, we're the best, that can be easily contradicted by offsite factors, Reddit posts, forum posts,
Mhm.
someone else's content. So, it's hard. It's hard. I don't know if anyone's cracked the code on this, but definitely I think people are outsourcing that shortlisting to AI search for sure.
Well, and it's a little bit like back in the day when I was building my first website for my first startup and someone came along and tried to sell me like 250,000 high authority backlinks, like all of those black hat SEO
Right.
tactics that did work until they didn't. And then I think eventually, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you're obviously the expert from my perspective, SEO kind of settled into what it really should have been all along was thoughtful content that was done carefully and with a way that was valuable and was driving what people were actually looking for and not necessarily just like backlinking to some shady website, halfway across the world. AI black hat tactics are probably gonna work for a while, like the one you just mentioned, right? They're gonna work for a while. Everyone's always gonna find ways to, play with the algorithm or whatever. So, how do we balance writing in a way that the algorithm gives us the attention that we want and we need as business owners, and the fact that at some point the AI is gonna have to start looking at what is the most valuable content for the human I am working with, and how will it start to filter that relationship or that partnership through the lens and experiences of the people who are using the tool.
Yeah, so I think you still want to put out thoughtful and original content because, at a certain point, like, the problem with, AI search in general is it's like an Ouroboros, right? Like it's kind of eating itself. And then it's like, well, because it's regurgitating so much content, it kind of creates a disincentive for people to create original content. So, like, that's why you're seeing companies like Gartner, really fall in terms of their stock price and things like that. But Gartner is the one that does the research, right? So, like, at a certain point, time will go on. Maybe Gartner puts out less research because it's not as profitable for them. And then, there's just less for the AI to draw on in the future. So, like, you should definitely put out thoughtful, original stuff, but you also have to structure it for AI search. So I think that's the big difference. So using things like H4 headings, those were not really super used, right? But now it's like, there's a lot of stuff going. Honestly, there's so much disinformation going around about AI search. I spend every day on LinkedIn, posting and engaging with people, and there's a lot of people like who are selling a lot of like bullshit, honestly.
Yeah. Well,
And
and they're capitalizing on this uncertainty and fear that we all have around being
100%.
left behind in the AI revolution, and they're capitalizing on it, and so they benefit from putting out bullshit because people are scared and people are nervous and people are worried that they're gonna be left behind in the same way that a lot of us kinda missed the boat on SEO back in the day. It's like history is repeating itself just with a different solution.
Totally. And it's crazy because a lot of these tactics they're recommending are just kind of like repackaged SEO things. So there's this thing, for example, about called chunking, where it's like an AI engineering term where, like, an AI crawler uses tokens and they only read like X amount of the text before, creating an assertion about it. And that's not really how you would want to write. Like, you should not just structure your entire article into like 100-word chunks, but
Yeah.
you could use more semantic headings and things like that. So, for example, like, usually maybe you do an H2 and a few H3s. There's no reason not to break up a big H3 section with H4s. Doesn't mean you should fundamentally change the article, right? But like, it doesn't hurt, and then it's a little clear. Things like, we've been doing a lot of this, adding FAQs. It actually works. So a good example was we had a page about our Power Center on premises solution that was kind of like a modernization page, but it was really about downloading the software. So the intent was people who were looking to download the on premises version of the software. That's not something you could do. So we kept the page because it's getting a lot of traffic, but the intent is not correct. So we used the page to kind of like educate the users about, like, Power Center is not a downloadable solution. You have to contact us to use IDMC, which is our cloud solution. Here's why. We kind of use the FAQs and some headings to do that. And then, not to say like you can validate everything by just going to an AI because it's so personalized, but, you could go to AI overviews and things like that because that's relatively standardish. And, now you can see, okay, it knows that you can't download Power Center, where like that's not something it knew before. So, like, we're using the FAQ to give it like new information it would not have gotten somewhere else.
So let's talk about, you mentioned Reddit, right? And the fact that a lot of these models are trained on Reddit. And I did hear, and I don't have the exact statistic, but a surprisingly large amount of Reddit posts have made it into, I think it was the ChatGPT training.
Yes.
Um, and so I think we do have to be very concerned about the models we're using and where they get their sourcing and their models, because I assume Grok is widely trained on X, right?
Yeah.
And all of that, and, like, do we really want to be creating our generative content based on the sludge that is coming from X and Reddit? Probably not. right? Especially if you're like a professional company who's trying to build professional things. So if there's all that kind of junk sourcing out there, how do we wade through this process of creating a user experience that works for the AI overlords in our future and one that still works for the human beings who actually have to read it? How do we avoid chunking while not missing out on the AI giving us the attention we need?
Yeah, I think just working with your subject matter experts, honestly, that's what I found has worked because I mean, I'm sure we're an enterprise company, but I'm sure any B2B, software company, really any larger B2B company probably has some level of like domain knowledge that's just not being utilized. Maybe it's in people's heads. Maybe it's just being hidden behind like ebooks or gated content. But the point is, it's not out there on the open web because, another thing is that AI crawlers can only read HTML, so it cannot read your PDF or anything like that. So like it needs
It
to be
can't. I did not
no,
know
no,
that.
no. Yeah, so it's a huge thing. We're actually working on what's called like a hybrid gating strategy. So we're essentially taking a lot of our big gated content, working with our subject matter experts, our product marketers, our content writers to kind of like ungate kind of like the key findings and takeaways of it. We still obviously you still want to get the email captured, right? Ideally,
Right.
but not at the service of, it just doesn't have this information. And if all your best information is hidden behind gated content, well, it's not surfaceable to AI crawlers.
I
So
think that's
that's
probably news to most people who are dabblers in AI and, like, decision makers in AI because I consider myself an AI OG, right? Like, I
mm.
was into it before there was even a paywall on ChatGPT. Like, I've really spent years now just really digging into this. It is news to me that it really reads HTML and doesn't do anything else.
Yeah, I think it's something a lot of people aren't aware of, and I just think for a lot of large organizations, just so much lives in PDFs. You can't read JavaScript either, so like if you have too much JavaScript on your page, that's a problem as well. So I do think there's yeah, a big thing. We need to kind of be aware of that, and we need to make sure that all of our content is readable, but also that it's structured and kind of like we were discussing. Adding things like FAQs, more defined section headers, things like that, so that there's a balance, right? There's a balance that I always think of it as like going back to the overrated, underrated thing. Like we need to be aware of this and we need to do things for it, but it can't replace an overall search strategy. And something that works for AI search but doesn't work for SEO, like doing those kind of listicles we were talking about, is really not worth pursuing because it's going to hurt you in the long run.
It almost occurs to me that this is really a great opportunity for all of our marketing and lead generation teams to kind of come together because it's not really enough to just have a great search strategy. You're almost needing to think much more holistically than we ever have before because of the way that AI interacts and because of the fact that we have people interacting with our experiences and our websites in whole new ways. It's not enough to just be good at SEO or be good at search engine, like, paid ads. You have to really be much more holistic than ever before.
Definitely. Yeah. At Informatica, we were actually able to kind of found an AI SEO tiger team. So that was myself, being the, resident SEO expert. And then, we brought in our CMO, our SVP for field marketing, our head of growth marketing, our head of web, product marketers as well. So like we were kind of able to kind of bring the whole band together and really dive into this because it's not, I think there's been this burden that's kind of put on SEOs in general. And I've been doing SEO for 10 years, and suddenly it's like you're also responsible for this AI search strategy, but there's so much else that goes into it. Like even like working with our PR team is something we've been doing. So like brand sentiment, narrative sentiment, things like we're talking about like the power center to IDMC shift. That's not really an SEO problem in the sense that's a narrative and brand perception problem, but it factors into AI search because for a company like ours, well, we want to show up in relevant ways, right? It's not about just showing up as many times as possible in irrelevant ways. We want to show up in ways that matter and ways that like push our brand story. And that requires getting the whole band together. That requires, creating a topical authority strategy, with our product marketers, making sure that we're hitting the different use cases and features, but also packaging it in a way that's not just product, right? So it's a balance. It's a balance, but it's really a team effort for sure.
Considering all of the people that you know or aspire to know, who else is out there? Who else do we need to be paying attention to?
So I'm gonna actually shout out some lesser known people because I feel like a lot of people probably are just like are going to shout out the top voices and SEO or digital marketing or whatever. So I'm going to shout out my friend Ben Steele. He works at Siege Media, and he's just like a really thoughtful presence on LinkedIn. That's Steele with an E, so Ben Steele. And then Charles Harris as well. He's a great guy. He works in SEO. He does a lot of consulting and things like that. And yeah, they're just both really, really thoughtful, lesser known voices on LinkedIn that I wanted to shout out.
And if someone is connecting with you, if they want to learn more, if they want to follow along, where can they find you online?
Yeah, so you could just find me on LinkedIn at if you just Google like Daniel Horowitz SEO, I'll come up. I have a very common name, but not in SEO, so that'll be me. But yeah, that's the bulk of my digital presence is on LinkedIn. I have a big following, post pretty much daily, so hopefully you'll get a lot of insights.
And you can find me also on LinkedIn. You search Alyssa Nolte, and if you find the Notorious Plant Killer, you know you have found the right one. I'm also writing on Substack. You can find me at alyssanolte.substack.com or search Alyssa Likes to Talk. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I have a feeling this is going to be a conversation that I'm thinking about for a long time, and I've already got like a list of things I need to be thinking about for updating our website to better reflect the AI revolution, which for now might be overhyped, but maybe not tomorrow.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alyssa. Really appreciate you having me on.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. There are millions of podcasts out there, and something like 70,000 new episodes are released every single day. It's not lost on me how lucky I am to have such an incredible community who show up and support this show. To be a guest or nominate someone who should join me on the pod, head to alyssanolte.com. And if you're looking for ad-free episodes, you can join me on Substack. I post all new episodes of my podcasts and share appearances on other people's shows, plus bonus content and updates on what I'm working on. Search Alyssa Likes to Talk or tap the link in the show notes.